Well, hello and welcome to our Zoom education session on understanding brain changes. Thank you for joining us for this discussion today. Understanding brain changes is a really important part of supporting a person living with dementia. Many of the changes that we see in person are a result of the changes that we can't always see that are happening inside the brain. So in this session, we're going to take a closer look at the different parts of the brain, what they do, and how they can be impacted in dementia. We're also going to discuss how these brain changes contribute to what we see day to day in the person that we're supporting that's living with dementia, as well as some tips and strategies for coping with the changes that do occur. My name is Sarah Cook, and with me today as my technical backup is Shelby Berry, and I'm very grateful for her assistance today. We are both education coordinators at the Alzheimer's Society of Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland, and Haliburton. And I just wanted to say at the outset that I understand that there may be some questions that do come up from our discussion today. Just in the interest of time, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of content to get through. And because I'm not always able to see the chat pod while I'm sharing my PowerPoint screen, it would be wonderful if we could hold questions until the end of the presentation. And I know that's hard sometimes because you want to ask a question and you don't want to forget your question. So feel free to jot that down, or you can enter it into the chat pod as well. And then towards the end or the conclusion of our discussion today, Shelby and I will both go through that chat pod and address any questions that are listed there. So thank you so much in advance for your help with this, and that will help to keep us on track with the content. So let's first begin our discussion today with taking a look at how the brain functions. The brain is the most powerful organ in the body, but when you think of it in relation to the rest of our body, it's really not all that large. It may be small, but it is definitely a mighty organ. In fact, the brain is the control center of our bodies, and it's responsible for every action and every thought. We're going to learn today how our actions, our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors can be impacted when there is a change in how the brain is functioning. And I thought that you might also appreciate hearing some fun facts about the brain just as we begin our discussion today. Sometimes we don't, such an important organ, we don't always know some of the key facts about the brain. So I thought we would start with a few of these facts. So did you know that the average human brain weighs approximately 3 pounds? Did you know that? The weight of the brain can actually range from as little as 2.8 to as much as 3.1 pounds. And for those of you that may be wondering, because I know this is probably your next question, yes, there may be a slight difference in the weight of male brains versus female brains. Okay. Male brains do tend to be on the slightly larger size, but don't worry, ladies, okay? I don't want you to worry about this, because this does not mean that men have more intelligence or more brain power. Size doesn't matter in the brain. There's no evidence that a larger brain is smarter than a smaller one. It's simply because males tend to be larger in size overall. So, sorry, gentlemen, I can't give you that one. I had to provide a little clarity to that fact, okay, just to set the record straight. Now, did you also know that they say that the texture of the brain is similar to firm jelly? Well, I can't say that I've felt a human brain lately, so I'm going to definitely take their word on that fact, but I thought that was quite interesting. Here's some other facts that you might find interesting and surprising about the brain. So your brain is nourished by one of your body's richest networks of blood vessels. When you're thinking really hard, your brain can use up to 50% of the fuel and oxygen in the body. That's a lot. That's a lot. With each heartbeat, your arteries carry about 20 to 25% of your blood to your brain. And that's where billions of cells use about 20% of the oxygen and the fuel that your blood carries. Now, when you are awake, Your brain generates about 12 to 25 watts of electricity, which is enough to power a small light bulb. And the brain also works very, very fast. The information that's going from your arms and your legs to your brain, get this, it travels at a speed of between 241 and 418 kilometers per hour. That is fast. So the brain consumes glucose from the body to produce this amount of energy. So that's huge too. That's a big fact. Here's another interesting fact. Consisting of a minimum 60% fat, your brain is the fattiest organ in your body. And this is why healthy fats like those omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids are vital for brain and overall body health. The healthy fat, it helps to stabilize the cell walls in your brain, and it can also reduce inflammation and help the immune system to function properly. So those are important fats. Okay, here's another one that you might not have known. About 75% of the brain is made up of water. And this means that dehydration, even as small as 2%, think about that, that's a small number, but even as small as 2%, dehydration can have a negative effect on our brain functions. So dehydration and a loss of sodium and important electrolytes can cause some changes in our memory and in our attention. And so to prevent any loss of body or brain functioning, we need to take some good steps to make sure that your body is properly hydrated. Now that we know the importance of hydration and water in the brain. And our final fact that I wanted you to think about today is, did you know that the term gray matter, you've heard that before, but the gray matter isn't actually gray at all? Now, while after death, the brain does turn a grayish color, hence the name gray matter, while you're alive, your gray matter is actually a healthy pink. And that's due to all the blood that's constantly flowing through it. So every time you think of gray matter now, you can actually think of pink matter. That's what it's about. So there's some facts to get you started. I hope we got your brain filled with lots of interesting facts as we start our discussion today. Let's take a look at the overall structure of this mighty organ. And you might already know that the brain is broken into two hemispheres. So we have the left side and the right side of the brain. And the left side is responsible more for our language and our analytical thinking skills. So that's where those, science and math abilities come in. But the right side is responsible more for our spatial relations, our attention, our focus. And that's more of the artistic or creative side of things. So we got the two hemispheres. And did you also know that the left part of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa? So the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. So it's kind of that cross action that we've got going on there, which is pretty interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the main structures that make up the brain in the hemispheres of the brain. Okay, so let's first talk about the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the area of the brain that fills up most of your skull. So hopefully you can see my little cursor moving here. But the cerebrum is this area here that encompasses those four main lobes, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And it basically controls the majority of the functions in the brain and the body. So it is involved in remembering, it's involved in problem solving, in thinking, in our feeling and emotions, and it also controls our movement. So the cerebrum takes up a lot of what our brain is responsible for. And as I said, it consists of these four lobes here. So the lobes of the brain can be found on both the left and the right hemispheres. So we're going to take some time to look at each lobe of the brain and what it's responsible for in just a few moments. And we'll start our discussion with that. Now, the cerebellum is this area, again, hopefully you can see my cursor moving, this kind of pinkish area here at the back of your head, and it sits under the cerebrum. It's what controls our coordination and our balance. So that's what the cerebellum is responsible for. And then here we have something called the brainstem, this little structure here. The brainstem sits beneath your cerebrum in front of your cerebellum, and it connects the brain to the spinal cord. And it is largely responsible for controlling our automatic, or what we often refer to as our involuntary body systems or body functions. So our breathing, our digestion, our heart rate and blood pressure, those kinds of functions. That's what the brainstem is there to control. So there's a lot going on in this little 3-pound structure that sits in our skull. And let's find out all about what's going on in the brain. So let's begin our exploration of the 4 lobes of the brain by starting at the front and kind of working backwards. Okay, that's the best way to kind of achieve our discussion, our explanation today. So the frontal lobe has a really big job, and it's responsible for a lot of key functions. The frontal lobe sits here at the front of our head. So if you can see again my cursor moving, it's that light purple lobe on the brain diagram. And it coordinates all of the functions that you see here listed on the screen. So I'm going to go through each of these and give you an idea of just how much the frontal lobe is responsible for. It's often referred to as the management center of the brain because of all the various functions that it regulates. So first of all, it's responsible for planning and organizing. So it regulates how we make our daily plans for our tasks and activities and how we organize our approach to participating in those tasks and activities. It's also responsible for the initiation of activity, or in other words, the starting and stopping of activities. So this can be thought of as the initiation function of the brain. And it acts like a little switch. So if you think of it as a switch, it acts when it's in the on position, it gets us up and going at an activity. Right? So it's in the on position, it's a go. But when it switches to the off position, that's when it tells us to stop doing that activity. And most of the time, our initiation switches are working well if we have good cognitive health. But we'll talk a little bit about what happens when there is a bit of a fault in that switch system. The frontal lobe is also responsible for the regulation of our activities, as well as our emotional control center. That's where the emotional control happens in the brain. And it also coordinates and is responsible for regulating our social skills. So all the social skills that we've learned throughout our life, that's where it's happening, is right there in the frontal lobe. Another main function of the frontal lobe is to provide our judgment and our decision-making abilities. So that includes our self-awareness and our insight. So this area helps us to use our judgment to consider when something is safe or unsafe. I don't always like the word appropriate versus inappropriate, but I hope that helps you to understand what I mean here, judging what is appropriate or accurate to do in that situation. So it helps us to make decisions and problem solve, and it provides insight into our actions and insight into our decision making. So there's a lot going on in the frontal lobe of the brain. And, let's go over to our next slide here. One of the first areas of the brain to be affected in dementia is indeed this frontal lobe. And as I mentioned, this is often referred to as the management center. So even early in dementia, we start to see some changes happening. And so what I wanted to do is, now that we just discussed each of those areas, I thought we would go through them again and indicate what could be experienced when someone has either damage or atrophy, which the other word for that is shrinkage and the gray matter tissue in that area of the brain. So what are we likely to see in the early stages of dementia or when the frontal lobe is being affected? So going back to that planning and organizing, the person may have trouble with familiar tasks like planning out a meal, right? Or they could have a hard time organizing a list of errands. So perhaps they need to go to the grocery store today and need to go to the bank. And there's a list of things that they need to be able to coordinate to get those errands done. And whereas often these tasks have been quite routine and familiar to them in the past, the person may start to um, see some difficulty in these areas. So the planning and organizing doesn't come as easily as it once did. In terms of that initiation that we just spoke of, that starting and stopping of activities, the person may seem to lose interest in activities or hobbies or interests that they have always enjoyed doing. And you might start to see them kind of pull away or pull back from those kinds of things. And it's also not unusual for the person to experience what is often known as it's a big word, perseveration. So you might have heard that term. Really, it means repetition, repetitious behavior. So the person could keep repeating an action or perhaps a word or a phrase. Maybe they're asking the same question over and over again or telling the same story over and over again. And that is essentially because that switch is stuck in the on position. So they kind of get stuck um, initiating that activity, and it's called perseveration. In terms of the emotional control and the social skill side of things, the person may now start to demonstrate emotional outbursts. So they might have unusual anger or frustration. They may say or do things that they normally would not. And this is where care partners and family members often get concerned because they'll say things like, well, that response seems really out of character for that person. So they really start to pick up and notice those kinds of changes or symptoms. In terms of judgment and decision making and that self awareness or insight piece that we spoke of, they may not be aware of changes in their abilities. And I will tell you that sometimes this looks to us as that the person's in denial. And really, it's not. It is a true lack of insight and awareness because of the damage that's happening to the frontal lobe. So they lose insight into their actions. They don't have that awareness that anything is changing or anything cognitively is failing them. So they don't always know. And the phrase that we use is they don't know that they don't know. So it may look like denial, but really it's the brain's inability to recognize the change that's happening there. And they may not, because of the changes in that insight and judgment, they may not recognize risks that could pose a major threat to their safety or their well being. So the risks don't seem very apparent to them. And that, of course, can cause a risk to their safety and their health overall. So we talked about a lot of changes there that happen in the frontal lobe. What I thought would be helpful next is to look at some tips for care partners and family members. So, knowing what we now know, in terms of the changes or symptoms that are happening from the damage to the frontal lobe, I thought we could offer some tips for care partners. And I want you to know that this is not an endless list because we would be here all day to come up with some great creative strategies for each of these areas. But I wanted to at least give you a starting point. So here's some things that you can practice or put into place and try out and see how they work for you if you know that the person with dementia in your life is experiencing some of these challenges. So in terms of planning and organizing, using checklists to help the person to stay organized and to know what tasks that they would like to complete are very, very helpful. And, laying out a checklist for that person helps to kind of organize what they need to do. And I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but I love checklists because checklists are so gratifying when you can just, scratch off, you can strike off that item or you can check it off. You can get lots like really creative with these strategies. You can, use a red pen or a highlighter. You can have fun with it, but checklists can be very helpful for the person. Laying out the supplies for the task or the activity that you wish for them to complete can also be very helpful when that planning and organizing function is impaired. So, for example, you could lay out the utensils and the ingredients for a meal in the order that they need to be used or in the order that they need to be added into the recipe. so that the person can still manage to, enjoy participating in the preparation of that meal with just a little bit of extra help in the organizing side. And then, another important thing to remember here is that, we want to support the person when needed and as needed, but we also want to resist that urge to hover over them or to take over the task. And you know what I'm talking about here, because I guarantee you that most caregivers out there have done this, because I've done this, right? Sometimes we think, oh, it's a little bit faster if I just take over and do that. Or, oh, I know what needs to be done here. Okay, so I don't want you to do that. I know that that's a great supportive thing that you're there to assist the person, but you also don't want to take away from their independence and their dignity. So allow them to do as much as they can, and you just offer that support as needed. Now, in terms of the starting and stopping of activities or that initiation piece, you may need to repeat invitations a couple of times to get them started at that activity. You can gently persuade them also to become involved in that task by saying something like, well, let's try this together. Or maybe you're trying to get them to go outside for a walk. You could say, well, let's grab your coat and let's get ready for our walk today. So you may need to provide those cues and mention it a couple of times, okay, because that initiation function isn't always working very well. Encouraging the person to try out activities, but also respecting their choice if they're determined that they just don't want to participate. So it may not be for them, and that's okay. So encourage them, but also be very respectful of that choice not to participate. And what I always say here is to try to find activities that are meaningful to the person. Because if you find something that's meaningful and enjoyable, it's going to encourage their involvement. So really try to own in on their interests, okay, to get them involved. And patiently encourage the person to start a new activity when they do become stuck on a repetitive one. And this does happen sometimes. So, for example, maybe you're watching that person polishing that countertop, and they've been doing that for a good 5 or 10 minutes. And you think, I don't know if they could get it any cleaner. Well, maybe you say something like, I'm really glad you were able to get that countertop so clean. Let's see if we can now work on setting the table for dinner next. Giving them an outlet, another option, another activity to move on to so that they don't get stuck in doing the same thing over and over. That perseveration can be very strong. So we want to gently try to break that. Here's a few more tips. So in terms of emotional control and social skills, acknowledge the emotions of the person. It's okay. It's actually a really good thing to say, you seem really upset or you seem frustrated, because sometimes they have a hard time giving voice to the emotions that they're feeling. And so by you validating that, it makes them feel that you're connecting with them and you understand. Try to gradually change activities if you know that the person is becoming frustrated or anxious. So gradually try to change them. We don't want them to continue on in that frustration or that feeling of being overwhelmed. And don't forget, it's okay to step back. It's okay to take a break. If the person is starting to feel overwhelmed, it's actually the best thing to do is kind of, take a break, wipe the slate clean for a moment, and then go back and reapproach it when the person seems a little bit more calm. That's always a very helpful strategy. In terms of the judgment, decision making, and self awareness concerns or challenges that may happen, okay, this one's a biggie. I know that as human beings, we are raised to always try to argue our points and to use our reasoning abilities. But I'm going to suggest here that you try not to reason or argue with the person and to recognize that they are losing their ability to effectively reason and use their problem solving skills. Remember that changes in their level of insight and in their self awareness often provide them with a sense of reality that is very different than our own. So their brain may be giving them access to information that doesn't correspond with our here and now reality. And so they believe it to be true, just like you believe the information that your brain is giving you to be true. And so unfortunately, if we try to reason or argue, we're just going to engage in that power struggle. And we really want to try to avoid that if at all possible. Help support decision making by talking it out and engaging in supportive dialogue. It's helpful to allow each person to share their thoughts and concerns, about the particular decision that needs to be made. Talk it out. Don't shut down. I know sometimes we get upset and we think, oh, I'm just going to withdraw and shut down, but it's not helpful to do that. So try to support some good supportive dialogue here. Acknowledge their feelings and their concerns, if they're expressing those things to you, and provide assurance and reassurance wherever possible. So, that can be very difficult for the person to try to give voice to how they're feeling and what concerns they have. And so providing that reassurance can make them feel like you truly understand and that you're on the same page. So I know that was a lot of information about the frontal lobe. So we talked about the areas of the frontal lobe, what they do. We talked about what happens when a person has some damage or atrophy in their frontal lobe. And then we gave you tips for care partners. And that's how we're going to carry on with that same structure throughout the rest of this presentation. We're going to talk about each lobe of the brain, talk about what those lobes do, where we might see some challenges when a person has dementia, and then to hopefully equip you with some tips and strategies for dealing with those changes. So we're going to carry on here. And the next lobe of the brain that we're going to look at is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe also has a really big job because it is responsible for all things that are related to our memory. The temporal lobes can be found there at the sides of our head. So as you can see, hopefully you can see my little cursor moving here. Hopefully it's showing up. But at the side of our head, this just positioned over our ears here in this dark blue region, that is the temporal lobe. And it coordinates all of the memory functions that you see listed here on the screen. So it coordinates our verbal memory, and that's what we use to help us to remember words or remember vocabulary and how to use those words correctly when we're referring to the names of things. The visual memory is what helps us to remember what we see. So, for example, the words and the sentences when we're reading a book to help us tell the plot of the book, what's going on in that book. We rely a lot on our visual memory to do that. It's also responsible for something called new learning. And this helps us to learn new information that our brain is taking in. So, for example, learning how to do something that someone has just shown to us. Maybe it's a new skill, it's a new activity. I often think of like the example of when you get a new cell phone, which happens, from time to time. And my husband, for example, he is so much more technologically sound than I am when it comes to cell phones. And so, when somebody's demonstrating the first time, how to put new telephone contacts into that cell phone, that's new learning. If it's something that you've not, if it's a new format of doing it, or if it's something that you haven't had the opportunity to do before, that's new learning. Short-term memory, that represents our memories of recent things. Okay, so what happened this morning, yesterday, last week, are recent conversations, recent details, recent events, those kinds of things that are needed to remember almost everything that we do. When you think about it, our short-term memory has a huge component in our day-to-day activities. And here's what's interesting is that our short-term memory is needed for new learning. We're going to come back to that, but it is absolutely necessary for new learning. And then our long-term memory. So this involves remembering information, experiences, how to do things that we've learned all throughout our lives. And the long-term memory usually stays intact until later in dementia. So it's usually there for quite some time, and eventually it will also be impacted. Let's look at what can be experienced when the temporal lobe is experiencing some damage or shrinkage, as we talked about, that can happen in dementia. So with verbal memory, the person may have trouble remembering words and how to use them correctly. They may have trouble understanding words of others and knowing the names of things. So they may become frustrated, trying to think of the right word, and then they become a little bit more vague in their speech. So if they forget, the name of something, they might say, I need that thingy to eat with. I need that thingy. That thingy that I need to eat with that. But they're really trying to think of the word for fork or for spoon. So you might be looking at them trying to supply that word or trying to come up with that vocabulary that's missing. And they may use words that are, they may use words incorrectly or words that are out of context. So I use this example quite often. I want a slice of coffee when really they mean a slice of cake. So they're using that word incorrectly. With visual memory, this can be very, very frustrating for a lot of folks, especially, in this example here, for avid readers. So they may be able to read. I think that cognitive ability to read is still present, but they may have trouble remembering what they just read. So they may get all the way to the end of the page in the book or the article, and they can't recall what they just read or what it was all about. And that gets very frustrating because of the deficit in that visual memory. So new learning, as I mentioned before, this could be trouble adjusting to new situations. So maybe the person is moving to a new place and they're having a hard time settling in because it's not familiar as their most recent home. It could also be, operating a new appliance. So I often use the example like a stove. After 20 years of using the same stove or the same appliance, you get really good at knowing all the bells and whistles and where the hot spots are. You get to know that stove kind of inside and out. But all of a sudden, that stove stops working for you and you need to replace it. Well, imagine, the trouble adjusting to using that new stove. Because let's face it, if it was 20 years ago when you bought it, even though you might try to find something with the same functions, things are quite different now because of technology. So adjusting to the use of that new appliance can be challenging for the person. The short-term memory. So this is what we had mentioned a little bit earlier, trouble remembering recent events and recent conversations can be a huge symptom when the temporal lobe is affected. And some of you may have heard me mention this little analogy before, but if you haven't, I hope it's helpful because there's always questions about, how short-term and long-term memory are affected in dementia, how that all works. How is the person able to talk about something that happened years ago, but they can't remember if they took their medicine this morning? How is that possible? So I use this little analogy of knitting a sweater to help explain that. So just go with me on this one. When you're first born and your brain starts to learn how to lay down memories, I want you to think of it as stitches in a sweater. So your brain learns how to lay down those memories over time and build on them, like stitches if you're knitting a sweater. Okay? And over time, stitch upon stitch, row upon row, you're building this beautiful sweater throughout your life until dementia happens. In that particular case, if dementia happens and you've, built this beautiful sweater, it's like getting to that point in the sweater. And as a result of the changes in the temporal lobe, you start to unravel those stitches row by row backwards. So if you can kind of visualize that, the last things that you learn, the last things that you remember are the first things that you lose. And that short-term memory continues to unravel further and further and further back. And so a lot of folks will say, well, the person is living in the past. Well, the person may seem like they're living in the past, but they're not. They're living in the present moment. But because of the short-term memory loss, their brain will present them with the memories that are most accessible. And at that point, it starts to become the long-term memories. So when the short-term memories are no longer there to call upon, the brain starts to substitute the long-term memories. So they may feel that what happened years ago is happening now. And that will continue further and further and further back. Eventually, the long-term memory will be compromised as well. And, they may have then trouble with familiar tasks like following a recipe, using tools, all the things that have been familiar to them in the past, tying their shoes, those habitual types of tasks or activities. And so thinking about that, that's often why we see somebody talking about things from long ago. They're more comfortable with those facts. Those are the facts that their brain is now giving them. And that is their new reality. So hopefully that helped to explain that a little bit using that analogy, because I wanted to offer some tips for us as care partners to how to support the person when they're experiencing these types of memory loss. So in terms of the verbal memory, we want to avoid using memory testing questions, if at all possible. We don't want to quiz the person. We want to offer information, but not to jump in right away. Let's wait and see if they want your assistance or they need your assistance. And listen for the message that they're trying to give you and watch their body language for additional clues that may help in communicating that message. So listen for the message, but sometimes when it doesn't make sense, you may need to watch for what their body is telling you, what their body language, their emotions, and so on. With visual memory, it can be helpful that if, again, the person really likes to read together. Reading together gives you that opportunity to talk about the meaning of what has been read as you go. So you can talk about the meaning and reflect on what's happening in the story or the article. And that helps sometimes for that person to feel more comfortable about the content. Consider providing audiobooks if reading is becoming too difficult for the person, but it's still something that they really enjoy. A great audiobook allows them to still stay immersed in a storyline without having to focus on the actual reading part. With new learning, using routines to learn new things. So it's important to note that unconscious memory is still present in dementia, and you can still learn by doing something over and over again. So building those routines, a person is able to remember if they do something over and over again. So people with dementia they cling to those routines, and it's very helpful to help them navigate with new learning opportunities. Trying to adapt familiar activities so that the person can do it more easily. I think back to that stove, for example. If they're trying to learn that new appliance, it's okay to give little cues or put little Post-it notes on the stove so they know what dial to turn on. Important clues or cues can help that message to become understood for the person. So don't be afraid to use those kinds of things. With short-term memory, I know it sounds kind of obvious when we say to be patient, but I think that it helps to remember that the person is not able to store that new information due to damage to their short-term memory. Because remember, we said short-term memory is needed for new learning. So I always think of your short-term memory like a bowl, and into this bowl throughout your whole life, you're constantly putting in new information. And that bowl is able to support that new information and store it and keep it for when you need it. The unfortunate part, though, is when the short-term memory starts to erode because of the changes in the temporal lobe, and that bowl starts to get some cracks and holes in it. So the more information you try to put in, the more it starts to seep out the bottom. And it's not the person's fault. The structure isn't there to hold on to those new memories anymore. And it makes it very difficult for the person because they get frustrated, and it's very easy for you to get frustrated too in supporting them. So think of that bowl when you're trying to relay that new information and they're having difficulty with it. Keeping a daily list of appointments and keeping calendars up to date can also be very helpful. Using a whiteboard calendar or a list on a whiteboard, um, it can be helpful to refer the person to. So, to help with that patience, sometimes we as care partners, we think, oh my gosh, I've told them 5 or 6 times and I don't know how to tell them without losing my patience. By establishing a whiteboard or a calendar like that, you can just point to the whiteboard and say, go and check and see what we've got on the go today, instead of you having to always be the one to verbalize that. That can help as well. With long-term memory, notice any frustrations and feel free to take that break from it. We don't want the person to become overwhelmed or frustrated. So take a break. Simplify the tasks as much as you can so that the person has a greater success in completing those tasks. Keep them as simple as possible. Give step-by-step instructions and check in for understanding. So when you've given that instruction, check in to make sure that they've understood before you go on to the next instruction. Share stories and ask questions about memories that the person had from long ago. Reminiscing and using that, accessing that long-term memory can be such an enjoyable experience for the person because they can talk about memories from the past. They're the most easily accessible when the short-term memory has been compromised. So, and I always say it's the most wonderful learning experience for those that get to listen to that storytelling. So it can be a mutually beneficial activity. So hopefully that was a lot again for, tips for care partners, but hopefully those tips are a great starting point for you. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list and you will want to add your ideas that are right for the person. We're going to keep moving us along. Again, we've got lots to talk about. The brain is responsible for a lot of important functions. So let's continue looking at something called the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is the logical thinking area of the brain. And these lobes can be found at the kind of the crown of your head. So it's that dark burgundy lobe here on the brain diagram. And it coordinates all of the functions that you see here on the screen. So it coordinates our logical thinking, our sequencing and use of numbers. Uh, it helps us to sense where things are in our environment in relation to where we are. It helps us to put things in order, the steps of a task or an activity. And it also helps with recognition of familiar people, places, and things. And so you can imagine that when this particular lobe of the brain is damaged or affected as dementia continues to progress, we're going to see some challenges here as well. So with logical thinking, the person may have trouble putting words in the right order and understanding what others are saying to them. So an example here might be, I'm looking for my cold sweater, when they're really trying to indicate that they're cold and they need their sweater. So they're mixing up the words, okay? They may have trouble with numbers, with using numbers, with mathematical abilities. They may find that managing their finances and balancing their checkbook or issuing correct payments, those kinds of things are starting to become increasingly more difficult for them. Sensing where things are in the environment, they may have trouble judging how close or how far things are away from them. So, they may bump into things in their environment or have trouble sitting down. So backing up, sitting down onto a chair, or even, backing into a car and sitting down can become increasingly difficult just because of the damage in this particular lobe. In terms of putting things in the right order, they may be able to do each concrete step of an activity, but they may have a really hard time doing all the steps together. So I say, think about making a pot of coffee. If you suggest or ask the person to go make a pot of coffee, that can be very overwhelming for them because of all the steps that are kind of floating around in their brain and where do I start first? But if you give them step-by-step instructions, that can be extremely helpful. So they'll still be able to make that pot of coffee and they'll use those concrete instructions to help them with that activity. And then with recognition of familiar, they may not recognize familiar places, objects, or people. And so that can be difficult. I know that's a difficult symptom for a lot of care partners and family members when they start to forget the familiar things in their environment. So let's look at some tips then to help assist with these areas. So with logical thinking, it's important to give the person lots of time and, lots of time to complete that task or activity and not to rush the person. They need time to process that information. Respond to the feelings that are behind the words and recognize that their words and their emotions may not match up. Okay, so it's important to look at the emotion to help understand the message. So they may say the words, I'm fine, but it's the way they say that. If they say that and they're angry or they say it and they're tearful, we need to really look at the emotion there because it's saying something very different. Offer help as needed. So, check in with them and say, hey, that looks a little bit tricky. Can I help you with that? Or are you looking for a word? Can I help you to find that word? Check in with them, offer that help and that support. And to include the person in financial decisions where possible, even if they're starting to struggle with these areas, and they need a bit of assistance from a supportive, care partner or a family member to provide some of those financial tasks. And, at the very least, we want to make sure that we're including that person in the decisions as much as possible to give them that autonomy and that independence. In terms of sensing where things are, removing tripping hazards in their environment to help them to navigate safely. That's key. We want to ensure their safety. Recognizing if they're having a hard time with balance to offer a hand or an arm to if they do seem a bit unsteady. Knowing that giving up activities like driving can be very hard for a person. And sometimes with changes in the parietal lobe, we do see them have to give up things like driving. And, we don't want to ignore it. We want to talk about it. We want to acknowledge those emotions and feelings because for most people, driving is a huge thing to give up after doing it for so long. And, it's changes in the brain that are causing that person to maybe not be able to drive safely. So it's not something that they're doing, it's the way that the brain is changing. So reassure them about that. And offer to help the person to do a task safely. So saying something like, let me go shovel that snow off the walkway first, and then you go out and get the paper, right? You go out and get the newspaper, but I just want to make sure that walkway is safe for you. So still allowing them to do something, a routine task or activity, but trying your best to make it a safe task or a safe activity. Putting things in order. So offering those step-by-step directions to help the person to complete that task. So we talked about that already, and that's very effective. But you can also set up the task so that the order doesn't really matter, whenever possible. Cutting up or putting salad ingredients together, cutting up the vegetables and putting the vegetables in the salad. There's no real particular order that needs to be done. So that would be a great task where the order doesn't matter. Folding a basket of towels, the same thing. There's no issue with the order. And so the person may feel quite comfortable engaging in a task like that. The recognition of familiar things, helping them to remember by gently offering that information. If you meet up with somebody that's familiar to you, but the person has a hard time remembering names, it helps if you can take the initiative to greet the person using their name, so that, oh, that's a clue for me. Okay, that's Frank. Okay, I can use that. I can use that name now. Labeling photos. If there's photos around the home or a photo album, if you can label them with the names of the people or the places that are in those photos, that's helpful. Labeling objects around the house. If there's a drawer where you keep the spoons or, a cupboard where you keep the mugs that you want the person to remember. Even other rooms around the house, like labeling where the washroom is, that can be helpful for them to recognize those familiar objects, people, and places. Again, a lot of information there. Hopeful that some of those are great starting point tips and strategies for you. I just want to move us along again to the occipital lobe. So you can see we're moving from the front to the back. The occipital lobe is the last lobe of the brain that we're going to look at. And it is the visual and perceptual processing area of the brain. So these lobes can be found, I know, at the very back of the brain. And you might be thinking, this little green section here, you might be thinking, how on earth is the visual and perceptual processing area at the back of the brain when our eyes are at the front? So it's very interesting. And this is a very well protected area of the brain back here. But this area does coordinate all of our visual and perceptual functions that you see here on the screen. So for vision, it's what that's how we're able to see our environment. It involves both our central and our peripheral vision. In terms of depth perception, that's the ability to see dimensions in our environment. So three-dimensional involves being able to see, over, under, around things, right? That three-dimensional aspect. And that takes place versus two-dimensional vision, which is like, for example, if you look at a storybook, a picture book page where everything appears flat. And eventually that depth perceptions we're going to talk about can be affected in dementia. And it's also how we understand sensory information. So our brain takes in a variety of information through our five senses, and it in turn interprets this information. So we'll talk about how these are affected in dementia next. And so as dementia continues and progresses further, when there is some damage to the occipital lobe, here are some of the things that may be experienced. So in terms of vision, the person often experiences a reduced vision. So it often reduces to the tunnel vision, only seeing what's in front. And it represents that loss of peripheral vision. So peripheral vision is what allows us to see around, where we're able to sense things on either side of us, even if we can't see them in full detail. We can still, our peripheral vision is able to tell us that there's things there. And it may be harder for the person to step backward or to sit down when they have lost that peripheral vision. So they have a hard time detecting how close objects are around them, where the chair is or the couch to sit on, that sort of thing can be very difficult when their vision is compromised. In terms of depth perception, the person may have trouble seeing around or behind or over or under things because everything blends together and appears continuous. So they go from being able to see in three dimensions to eventually being able to see only in two dimensions. So therefore, they have a hard time telling how high something is, or deep or long, wide, near, or far. Think of all of those directions that we use in our environment to see. And when that depth perception is affected, that can be very difficult for that person to safely and confidently navigate their environment. In terms of understanding sensory information, the person may mistake one object for another. And this is where we have to be very careful as care providers because there could be safety concerns. And I'm going to use a really graphic example here. And I don't want this to seem overwhelming, but it's important for us to know just the extent to which this can happen. So I want you to imagine a razor and a toothbrush lying side by side on a bathroom counter. And you've just cued the person to go in and brush their teeth, but they forget which object is for which purpose. And so it has been done. It has been done. And it's also more simple things too, right? Just not being able, to know a knife from a fork, those kinds of things. But mistaking one object for another is quite common. The person may also find glare or glare on the windows or shadows in their room unsettling. And it can even go so far as to create fear or anxiety for the person. So they might see their reflection in the window and not know that it's their reflection. So they see, to them, it looks like a person, standing and looking in at them. They may not, they may see a tall lamp in the corner of their room as a person standing there if the room is not well lit. It may take on that image of a person that's lurking there, and that can feed that fear or anxiety. So, some tips for care partners then to help assist in these areas. For vision, it's helpful if we always walk toward the person from the front so that they can see our approach. We don't want to approach them from the side or from behind because, again, they've lost that peripheral vision and we may elicit a startle response. We may startle the person in a very negative way. So try to, even if you have to approach around the side and approach from the front, that's really helpful. Making sure that the person sees you before you start even talking. So make eye contact with them, call their name, use their name. Make sure that you're sitting facing or standing facing the person so they do understand your intent to communicate with them. Kind of make sure that you set the stage for good communication. In terms of depth perception, be patient and don't rush the person. They may need more time to feel safe navigating through their environment. So the more we rush them, the more worried or panicked that they get. And we really don't want them to have a fall. We want them to remain safe in that environment. Thinking about, railings and grab bars being installed to promote balance and stability. Those are great strategies as well as the person continues to progress through dementia. Offering a hand to sit down or when using the stairs if the person seems a bit wary or unstable. Those are great tactics as well as a care partner. Trying to get rid of shadows if that sensory information is not being understood. Trying to reduce the shadows in a room by increasing the lighting, making sure the room is well lit. Consider closing curtains if the glare on the windows is a bit unsettling for them, if they're starting to really worry about that kind of image. If the person is upset or anxious in that environment, try to be as reassuring and comforting as you can be and, offer to walk through the room or around the room with them to increase that comfort level, to show them that, there's nothing there to be concerned about. You could do a walk through before even, or a walk through with them just to get them comfortable with that environment that seems to be changing for them. Okay. Now, this isn't a lobe of the brain, but this is an actual system within the brain, and it's a very important system um, that is not shown on the former brain diagrams on the other slides. So this is kind of like a secret system, I like to think of it, because it's housed right in the core of your brain. You can't actually see it because it's right in the center. And it is a very important system to understand in terms of increasing our understanding of how dementia affects the brain. And it is responsible, the limbic system is responsible for connecting the frontal and the temporal lobes. So, in other words, it connects behavior and memory. It makes the correlation between those two things. It also controls our emotions and it also controls our daily functions. So, we talk about this last because, it really is important to understand how behavior and memory come together, how they work together in so much of what we do. So here are some things that can be experienced when the limbic system is experiencing some change. So the person may act on wrong information because the memory is not working properly. So they may think that their son is their husband So if the son and the husband share very similar physical features, she may think that her son is her husband, right? So that's a misperception there. Or the person may believe that they have to go and pick up their kids from school if they think that they still have small children. Remember, they're accessing information from their long-term memory, not their short-term memory. So it causes that confusion sometimes. It also controls the emotions. So they may have extreme emotions that change quite quickly for them. So rapid mood shifts, they can go from calm to tears to anger in a matter of moments for what seems like no apparent reason. They may feel irritable or depressed or anxious and even overly tearful and not be able to explain or understand why that is. And I did meet a person with dementia that told me one day, he said, Sarah, I've never been a very, emotional person. I never really cry, but now because of this dementia, like I don't know what's changing, but I'm so tearful all the time and I don't know how to explain it. And I was telling him, it's part of that part of the brain that is being affected that regulates those emotions. We're starting to see some challenges there. So I think that was a helpful answer, but it is very difficult when people don't understand why that's happening. Because of the way that it controls our daily functions, the person may have trouble sleeping, or they could have sleep disturbances in that normal sleep and wake pattern. They may experience also changes in their appetite, causing them to either eat more or to eat less. And, when you think about it, their brain may not remember to tell them to eat, right? Or when to eat. Or they may eat many times throughout the day because their brain forgets that they've already eaten. So either of those scenarios can happen. And so what can we do as care partners? Well, let's look at some tips that may assist us when we're experiencing some problems in the limbic system. So it helps to acknowledge their concerns and help to solve the problem. If they think that someone, for example, their behavior and their memory, there's that glitch there. If they think that, someone has stolen their purse or their wallet, just because they've forgotten where they put it, they may assume somebody stole it. It helps to take up the search to find that. You'll become the hero if you can help them to find that missing purse or wallet. Again, don't try to argue or try to reason, because keep in mind that loss of insight, that self-awareness, the loss in those reasoning abilities can make it difficult for that person to problem solve and use that logical thinking that they always have. In terms of controlling emotions, reassure if they are anxious or upset, provide that reassurance and acknowledge their emotions. Say something like, well, you feel that someone stole your purse? Well, no wonder you're so upset. I can imagine, acknowledging and validating how they're feeling. Stepping back and dropping the issue, or just taking a break. I'm telling you, a deep breath is sometimes our best tactic. We just oxygenate the brain, step back, and reapproach it again after. And, just support the person by helping them to make choices that will work for them. So if you can engage the person in exercise, to go outside for a daily walk to keep them, active, to release any negative pent up energy so that they can sleep a little bit better at night. That's a very helpful tactic. If they're forgetting to eat, try leaving some healthy snacks out in visible places as a bit of a reminder for them to eat. Or you take snack times and meal times with the person, so that when they see you eating, it will cue them to do the same. So you act as that cueing system for them. Those things I'm hopeful, will be helpful for you when dealing with some of the changes in the limbic system. And I know we've gone over our time a little bit, but I did want to quickly touch on the two last structures of the brain. So where the limbic system is in the core of the brain, the lobes are in that cerebrum. The cerebellum and the brainstem are also key to understand in terms of their functioning and what they do towards, often towards the later stages of progression of dementia. So, as we said, the cerebellum, it controls, so it's this area here, this pink area here at the base of the cerebrum. It controls our voluntary motor movement to help us navigate our environment. So we often refer to this as the area that provides that purposeful movement. And it also regulates our posture and our balance. And the brainstem is what connects our brain to the spinal cord. And it controls and regulates our involuntary systems. Those body systems like the heart, the lungs, the digestive system. That's what the brainstem does. So when we look at what may be experienced, we can see a variety of changes here. When there's damage to the cerebellum, the person will have problems with that voluntary motor movement or controlling their movement and directing their body parts to do what they need them to do. They may also experience changes in their posture and have a difficult time holding their body upright in that upright position. The person can also experience a loss of balance, which can lead to problems with instability. We talked a little bit about that, problems navigating safely through that physical environment. And unfortunately, it can lead to an increased risk of falls for that person. When we look at the brainstem, the person's involuntary body systems can begin to deteriorate, and they can involve heart problems, problems with breathing, trouble swallowing, and even changes in their digestive systems. This usually comes more towards the later stages of the progression. And so, just to give you some tips, because I know that some of these changes can be difficult, but here are some starting points to be thinking about. So again, think about the environment, creating an environment that can be safely navigated. If it's possible to remove, any trip hazards or clutter that might be in the person's way from freely moving, blocking off stairs, blocking off that access to stairs so they don't have a fall down the stairs, removing any excess furniture, again, to make it a little bit easier to move about. Ensuring that the person is wearing supportive footwear too, so that they can safely navigate throughout the home or the environment. Avoiding shiny, glossy or slippery surfaces, that can cause those reflections and glare, which can be unsettling for the person as well. Removing scatter rugs, those can be trip hazards as well. So we want to be cautious about that. We want to reduce the risk of a fall. Installing safety features. So we mentioned that earlier, those grab bars, railings, a shower seat in the bathroom can be very helpful for them at this stage. We may also need to assess if the person requires a wheelchair or a walker to assist with a safe sense of mobility. So that would be something that you would want to check on as well. And then finally, we want to make sure that we speak to the doctor about any concerns around swallowing or breathing, any other health concerns. You want to make sure that your healthcare provider is aware of those kinds of things, because they may have some tips and strategies to assist you. And that's really important. Want to make the person, also as comfortable with as possible. So if they're having problems with breathing and swallowing, we want to make sure that they are feeling more comfortable, and if that's possible, it's great to check in with your healthcare provider. Okay, so we talked about a lot in our presentation today, because when you start to break down the different areas of the brain, including the parts that we can see, right, like the lobes and the cerebellum and the brainstem, but also the parts that we can't see, like the limbic system that connects those inner lobes. And so I know that was a lot of information. I just want to remind you, if you are experiencing some of these changes, that living with and supporting somebody with dementia is not always easy, and we want you to know that you're not alone and that we are here to support you. We have a range of services, to meet your needs, and so you just don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions or you would like more information on any of these areas. We have some helpful tips and resources that we can share with you, and just also to offer that ear to listen if you're dealing with any of these particularly challenging symptoms or changes. And just wanted to show you some of the resources that we use today. There's if you'd like to take a look at a brain tour, there's some interactive brain tours that are available. And if you found that those different brain facts were helpful at the very beginning, there's lots more. There's lots more to learn about the brain. So I just wanted you to be aware of that as well. And of course, now that we're a little, oh, I'm sorry, we're a little over our time today. Lots of information, but I wanted just to see if there was any questions that you had. So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing